Perfetto. Allora, intanto chiedo se Andreas lo vedo collegato. Perfetto. I switch to English, of course, and I really thank Andreas Flicker to be here in order to do the keynote speech. And I strongly wanted him to be here because I am an historian, actually. So in the first 2 days of this Congress, I listened a lot of very interesting things, but not in my field, or something in my field, but not everything in my field. But now I am really looking for what Andreas is going to say, to tell us, and in order to present Andreas, I tell everybody that he is director of the Luxembourg Center of Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History, and is professor also of Contemporary and Digital History at the University of Luxembourg, and he is an expert in the theory and method of historiography, in particular in the field of digital history and audiovisual historiography. So also in cultural history and its media, history of technology, transnational and European history, material and cultural studies, and regional history. His speech will be about a very interesting thing, or for me, a really interesting thing, that is digital public history, a plea for a reflexive turn. And I really am interested to listen this plea for a reflexive turn. So Andreas, please, you have the voice now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Enrica, for this kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be with you today. Thank you for the invitation of speaking to you today. I'm sorry that I can't do it in Italian. I would love to speak Italian, but it's just enough to order a pizza, but not more. Yeah, I will try to share my screen with you, and let me know if it works. No. Okay. In 1931, the leaving president of the American Historical Association, AHA, Carl Becker, delivered his presidential address at Minneapolis entitled "Every Man His Own Historian." In his provocative speech, Becker challenged the community of professional historians by arguing that history, when reduced to its lowest terms, is the memory of things said and done, and that everyone, both the professional historian and Mr. Everyman, fuse personal memories and facts of the past in an act of imaginative creation. To quote, "The appropriate trick of any age is not a malicious invention designed to take anyone in, but an unconscious and necessary effort on the part of society to understand what it is doing in the light of what has been done and what it hopes to do." More than 8 decades later, another outgoing president, this time of the Organization of American Historians, OAH, revisited Becker's thesis in the light of the digital condition. In Everyone Their Own Historian, Ed Ayers, undoubtedly one of the pioneers of digital public history, stresses that the digital turn has morphed our private histories and the artificial memories that constitute history even more completely and to such a degree that boundaries between them blur and disappear as everyone has become their own historian, their own curator and archivist and narrator. Ayers celebrates, I quote, the multiplicity in the forms of history because of our common bias of accountability to the historical record, end of quote. And just like Becker, concludes his address with a strong plea for civic engagement of historians. I quote again, "Our profession will flourish by collaborating with everyone respectful on that evidence, with every teacher, every writer, every blogger, every podcaster, every filmmaker, every archivist, every interpreter of public history, by being an ally for everyone who explores American history for the greater good." So despite the considerable temporal distance between the two events, both speeches share a strong pathos and basically fight for the same cause. They empathically call on the responsibility of historians as public actors based on their personal experiences and critical awareness or witnesses of their own time. Doing history, whether as professional, public, or private historian, means critical engagement with both the past and the present, and whatever means used for reaching that goal are fine. Seen in that light, it would be tempting to identify the internet as the digital technology, exactly this kind of malicious invention mentioned by Becker, and to interpret the digital condition of today's historical practice as the trick of our age. Yet the aim of my lecture is to reflect both on the possibilities, but also on the limitations, the great potential, but also the risks that the digital offers to public historians in a time characterized by pragmatic hybridity. Instead of sketching the present state of hybridity as a bipolar discourse of hopes and fears, preachers of technological solutionism on the one side and digital Luddites on the other, so typical for moments of disruptive innovations, I will try to reflect on the heuristic potential, the epistemological consequences, and last but not least, also the ethical implications of digital approaches in public history in the light of what I call digital hermeneutics. Digital hermeneutics can be defined as a set of skills and competences that allow historians to critically reflect on the various interventions of digital infrastructures, tools, databases, and dissemination platforms in the process of thinking, doing, and narrating history. Nowadays, all stages of realizing a public history project are to a stronger or lesser degree shaped by the use of digital infrastructures and tools. Be it the browsing on the internet, taking notes of an interview on a laptop, capturing digital photographs in archives or museum collections, recording an oral history testimony on the mobile phone, or the organization of crowdsourcing activities on the web. The workflow, the total workflow of historical research is deeply shaped by digital interventions. While one can argue that most public historians have become digital by now, as all historians or all humanities scholar, I would say, one has to emphasize the fact that many remain strongly embedded in analog practices and traditions. This current duality or parallelism of analog and digital practices forces public historians to experiment with the new while keeping established norms of valid historical practices alive. if we accept that hybridity is the new normal, as Gerben Saarsma, a colleague of mine in Luxembourg, said, I argue that we need an update of our historical hermeneutics that problematize the in-betweenness of our current practices. But instead of falling into the trap of asymmetric conceptions, analog versus digital, or qualitative versus quantitative, close versus distant reading, the concept of digital hermeneutics proposes a critical framework for making the methodological and epistemological tensions involved in our practices explicit. As Anita Lucchesi, a former PhD student of mine from both Brazilian and Italian roots, has demonstrated on her thesis on the example of building a digital memory platform on migration memories in Luxembourg, the hands-on approach of doing collaborative and participatory digital public history asks for critical reflection on the many interferences, as she calls it, of digital tools, infrastructures, and data in the co-creation of public history narratives. The co-design of an internet platform, such as her project Memo Record, taking place in the trading zones of digital public history practices, is characterized by many epistemological uncertainties and what she calls experimental heuristics of grasping. So turning a prototype of a website aiming at collecting mediated memories posted on social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram into a public history platform was a nonlinear, iterative process characterized by many detours, serendipities, and even failures and mistakes. In fact, planning and realizing Memo Record turned the digital public historian into what we call at C2DH a thinkerer, an experimenter playing with the possibilities of the digital while remaining self-critical towards its inherent possibilities and limitations. So thinkering tries to combine this idea of hands-on tinkering, playing around with tools and technologies, and the critical thinking. Translated into the practice of doing public history in the digital age, it is the digital kitchen that we need to investigate as the place where the raw is transformed into the cooked. Building on the kitchen metaphor, Anita Lucchesi describes the mediated memories as tiragostas. So in Brazilian and Portuguese, appetizers, the historical context as menu, and the Memo Record platform as the digital kitchen she used for producing the digital history project. To summarize, digital hermeneutics as hermeneutics of in-betweenness problematize the many tensions between the analog and the digital, the browsing and the searching, the scanning and the reading, sharing and engaging, accessibility and interpretation, inscribed into the current practices of doing public history. Such hermeneutics of screwing around, as David Ramsey once characterized them, not only ask for a self-reflexive approach of those doing digital public history projects, but are a real challenge when it comes to the documentation and ethical implications of such a work with and within the digital. While the practices of public history are undoubtedly affected by digital technologies, most public history projects entertain a rather instrumental relationship with the digital as mode of diffusion or representation of the past. As public historians most decisively aim at co-producing and sharing historical knowledge with their audience, I argue that we need a more systematic reflection on how this vision of shared authority is affected by the nature of the digital as the new ecosystem of historical practice. If we acknowledge that the gap between the raw and the cooked in digital public history practice remains substantial, as suggested by Michael Frisch, we need to investigate how the digital interferes in the collaborative endeavor of making sense of the past altogether. As Thomas Cauvin and Serge Noiret have argued, doing public history by using digital tools, infrastructures, and platforms definitely fosters new ways of collaboration, communication, and the production of so-called user-generated content. I agree. Yet, a systematic reflection on how the digital really changes or impacts on the thinking, doing, and telling of history in the age of abundance and accessibility is still largely lacking. As the example of many public history projects in the making during the COVID-19 pandemic shows, the synchronic temporality and global connectivity of the internet is having a deep impact on how crowdsourcing activities are designed, managed, and performed. So in Luxembourg, we have, as in many other countries, I know that you have a similar project in Italy. We've started a digital public history project collecting memories of the pandemic, and this is the website we developed for it. During a recent workshop on so-called memory banks projects held at the C2DH in November last year, the initiators of projects in Austria, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Portugal, and Switzerland shared their experiences and looked back at the recent history of their COVID-19 memory platforms. In difference to earlier and well-known memory bank projects such as the 9/11 Digital Archive or the Hurricane Katrina Memory Bank, the COVID-19 projects are faced with an event which is still unfolding as the collection process takes place. Doing such public history projects in real time, therefore, challenge classical forms of historical scholarship, both in terms of infrastructural investment, online communication, and critical reflexivity. It is interesting to know that all initiatives that were presented at the workshop were a little disappointed by the response of the public. A sobering observation was that even advertisement campaigns on social media to promote submissions to the various portals had no measurable effect on the number of entries uploaded to the platforms. As Enrico Natale pointed out somewhat cynically, the vast majority of work in digital participatory projects remains on the shoulders of a very small group of enthusiasts. Considering the plurality of publics that digital public history projects have to deal with, sharing authority between professional historians and those publics ask for a more systematic reflection on when, how, and where those publics are truly involved in the co-production of historical knowledge. Involving people in a mediated process of crowdsourcing or organizing history harvests with the local communities not necessarily involve a real sharing of authority when it comes to the managing, curating, or long-term accessibility and preservation of the data produced. The crowd rarely participates in the design or architecture of databases or the definition of metadata standards that ultimately define the limits and possibilities of findability of information in a structured database. So digital public history projects with a real equality of ownership and responsibility of interpretation of history are extremely rare, as acts of participation are often solicited, controlled, and institutionally framed. Nevertheless, as for example, the Para-Archive project in Great Britain shows, systematic co-design can enable real community-based participatory research in the field of digital public history. An approach that has been successfully tested and implemented in the field of public health, for example. But if the codes of web-based public history applications are not made available or shared on open source platforms, such as GitHub, digital public history projects are susceptible of reinforcing knowledge asymmetries between historians, engaged participants, and technical collaborators, such as coders, programmers, web designers, or data stewards, instead of really enabling a true democratic encounter. So translating the concept of shared authority to the digital requires that data should be findable, requires sharing data based on the FAIR principles. So co-produced data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and most of all, reusable. At the C2DH, we try to systematically share the code of our digital public history projects on GitHub, as the example of our online platform for digital source criticism, Ranke2, shall illustrate. So I will stop sharing my PowerPoint and just try to share my Internet Explorer with you. So this is the project. For example, we developed Ranke2, an open access platform for teaching digital source criticism, and all of the lessons we have produced in this platform are really stored on GitHub, as are the many virtual exhibitions we have been doing. So this is our GitHub repository, and if I go to, for example, Ranke2, our project, you see that, for example, all the assignments that we developed, for example, the lesson on the archival turn in the different languages, be it German, French, or English, are really made accessible in their entirety. And the same goes with the code that we have been programming, for example, for the virtual exhibitions. So I'll go back to the PowerPoint. So shared authority, in my view, also means shared responsibility in terms of data management. To thrive on open science, digital public historians have to be explicit about their responsibilities in co-producing historical data and sharing expertise and knowledge with their publics. Many public history projects rely on a rather colloquial understanding of openness, participation, and interactivity, often concealing hidden power structures or actons, to use the Latourian term, outside the trading zone of digital public history projects, such as the software, cloud infrastructures, or data protection and copyright laws. So with regard to digital public history projects, we certainly cannot deny that interactive designs enable users to explore nonlinear narratives and to discover history in an interest or curiosity-driven mode. At C2DH, we have been experimenting with a number of so-called virtual exhibitions in order to explore new ways of storytelling online. The first virtual exhibition we realized focused on the unknown history of Luxembourg during the First World War, aiming at offering a multilinear, multi-perspective view on this episode, combining different narrative formats and strategies. A classical timeline view, a spatial approach, so an interactive map, a thematic structure, and a discovery mode for the whole collection of digitized sources on which the exhibition is built. For this, we developed a kind of modular narrative editor in which we can combine different kind of media, text with images, with audio, and so on. So this is a very basic way, of course, of building such virtual exhibitions. But we tried really to think about the think through digital media, as Dale Hudson and Patricia Zimmerman have put it, and to really reflect on the affordances of the digital media in producing new transmedia, intermedia storytelling. I can again stop sharing the PowerPoint and go into an example of such an exhibition. For example, this is, go to the start. This is the exhibition on the First World War we did. Of course, you can discover the content by looking at different topics, occupation, hunger, and then this takes you through to a kind of linear narrative based on this kind of thematic thread. You can, of course, view the map and zoom in and out into the country, look at different kinds of interest, different areas of interest, like bombed sites, cemeteries, hospitals, and you can filter this by time. Then we have the classical kind of timeline approach, where you can look at specific events. And if we have on specific dates sources in the collection, of course, you can always then go and have a look at the different sources being used. And this brings me to the last level, which is basically the whole collection view, where you can zoom in all the sources then that have been digitized for the exhibition. In a more recent example, this is in a virtual exhibition we did on the history of the PTT, the Post and Telecommunication Office in Luxembourg. We reused, of course, these basic functions of the timeline, which you can filter, but we added then a new feature. That's what we try with every new virtual exhibition we develop. We try to add a new kind of narrative feature. In this exhibition, we added, for example, in the collection 3D photography of objects we did, where you can zoom in and out. And we added what we call the so-called thematic dossiers, which are all based on oral history interviews that we produced with witnesses who speak. For example, here, an engineer from the telecommunications departments, they tell their stories in Luxembourgish. We automatically then translate this into French. And when he speaks about things we have also in the collection of objects, then the interview makes also the link to these objects so that you can stop and have a look at these different kinds of sources we have in the collection. Go back to the PowerPoint. So while we definitely recognize the ludic and didactic potential and immersive qualities of such user-driven and explorative, am I muted? No.
No, it's we listen to you.
Okay, sorry. I saw a message on the screen saying you're muted. So while we definitely recognize the ludic and didactical potential and immersive qualities of such user-driven and explorative designs of digital public history platforms, we should, on the other side, be careful about overemphasizing the democratic potential of, or truly collaborative nature of such highly stylized and fashionable outputs, which definitely rely on a lot of technical expertise and serious funding, respectively financial means. So in a recent volume on the participatory condition, the editors rightly warn that participation, styled as interactivity, has become a preferred engine of commerce, consent, and control. The democratic potential of such database histories has to be read against the disciplining power of interactive and participatory designs. Despite the freedom that users may experience in browsing through online exhibitions or crowdsourced collections, the explorative possibilities remain framed by indexical regimes and design principles of the content management system. This is what Barney et al. Call the deep ambiguity of the participatory condition. On the one side, participation has evolved into a leading mode of subjective interpellation, yet on the other, it increasingly informs business models in the cultural sphere. Participation, to put it bluntly, is not engagement, and interactivity is not shared authority. This brings me to my last point of reflection, the ethics of doing digital public history. As our own reality can no longer be thought of as separate from digital media, the transformation of historical information and sources, such as oral testimonies of Holocaust survivors, into data raises significant ethical issues too. Using the example of the database of the Shoah Visual History Archive, containing more than 50,000 survivor testimonies in 39 languages from 61 countries, amounting to more than 100,000 hours of testimonial, Todd Presner has convincingly demonstrated the need to locate the ethical in digital and computational modalities of representation. His plea for the ethics of the algorithm is based on the assumption that computation as a genre of historical representation that includes data, databases, algorithmic processing, and visual information visualization is not a value-free process, but instead requires ethical reflections on how information architectures, indexes, and visual interfaces turn historical narratives into data. As there exists no transcript of the video testimonies in the archive, a keyword indexing system consisting of a thesaurus linked to particular segments of a video is the only way to search the content of the testimonies. This process, described by Presnau as defiguration, as it evacuates all traces of the figurative, is a fundamentally interpretative process characterized by the creation of a data ontology that, I quote, has expelled the latent, the performative, the figural, the subjunctive, the tone of questioning and doubt, the expressiveness of the face, and the very acts of telling and failing to tell that mark the contingency of all communication. End of quote. So without the critical repertoire of digital hermeneutics, I argue, the visitor of or user of such a virtual in-between space can hardly engage in a critical dialogue with the past. As Alina Bote has shown in her recent dissertation on the representation of the Shoah in the virtual space, the Shoah Foundation has recently shifted towards less aestheticized virtual exhibition designs and organized workshops on what they call ethical editing, in which questions of digital source criticism and responsible practices of editing authentic historical testimonies were discussed with teachers and researchers. These trainings are a concrete example of applying digital hermeneutics in digital public history education. As future generations of digital public historians are likely to be confronted with the ethics of data integrity and algorithms, we need to sensitize the community for a careful reflection on how computational processes do intervene in the production of digital representations of past events and facts. We need to scrutinize the visual evidence and look of certainty of the increasingly complex visualizations of historical data in digital public history projects. A better understanding of the complex interplay between what David Barry has called the commodity layer and the mechanism layer, so the front end and the back end of continuous interfaces, will become a key competence for digital public historians who ground their work ethics in the digital hermeneutics of in-betweenness. I conclude. I think it's our responsibility as digital public historians to develop reflexive interfaces for websites, databases, and apps really driven by the ambition to inscribe, in the Latourian sense again, the basic principles of digital hermeneutics into the very design of the back end and the front end. Users need to be continuously confronted with the fact that they actively manipulate data when interacting with responsive design interfaces and dynamic data visualizations. The increasingly complex visualization of our data or research results asks for a critical reflection of what Karen Knoch-Ketina calls screen reality, or the representation of our knowledge online. So opening up the black boxes of virtual representations of the past, be it virtual exhibitions, computer games, or 3D models, is a must. Interface criticism is therefore likely to become the key competence of any critical engagement with digital public history outputs in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andreas. It's really, really interesting what you have said. You have give us a lot of things to think. I note a lot of things that that are very interesting and very engaging, I have to say, for the public historian and for the digital humanist at large.